8:47 a.m. Tuesday, Glenview Manor Senior Care Facility, Tampa, Florida. The fluorescent lights hum over polished linoleum. A night nurse in pale blue scrubs signs a clipboard at the medication station. Down the corridor, room 214 holds an 87-year-old woman named Eleanor Whitfield, a retired schoolteacher with advanced dementia. Her family pays $9,400 a month for her care. Outside, 3 black Suburbans roll into the visitor parking lot with their headlights off. 22 FBI agents in tactical vests move through the front entrance at 3:51 a.m. The receptionist, a 24-year-old woman named Brittany Cole, freezes behind the desk. She does not call for the administrator. She does not reach for the phone. She runs. She makes it 40 feet before she is on the floor in handcuffs. What agents expected to find that morning was a routine Medicare fraud operation. Inflated billing. Phantom services. Maybe a few forged signatures on therapy logs. The kind of white-collar paperwork crime that fills federal dockets across the country every week. What they found instead would reframe a 3-year investigation into something far darker, far larger, and far more disturbing than anything the Tampa field office had. Pursued in over a decade, by sunrise, agents had recovered ledgers documenting the systematic financial exploitation of 217 elderly residents across 4 states. By noon, they had identified the first victim of human trafficking. By the end of the week, they had uncovered an interstate criminal enterprise that had operated, undetected, inside America's nursing home system for nearly 7 years. This is the story of how it happened, how it was hidden, and how a single anonymous tip cracked open one of the most disturbing elder exploitation cases in federal history. The man at the center of it all does not look like a criminal. His name is Dr. Marcus Holloway. 61 years old, a licensed gerontologist with 34 years of clinical experience, a published researcher on dementia care, and the founder and CEO of Holloway Senior Health Group, a privately held company that operated 11 licensed long-term care facilities across Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. He served on the board of the Florida Healthcare Association. He testified before state legislators on patient protection standards. He gave a TED Talk in 2019 titled Dignity in the Final Decades. He attended his granddaughter's piano recital the night before his arrest. To his staff, he was a meticulous administrator who quoted scripture in company-wide emails. To regulators, he was a model operator with cleaner inspection records than 94% of his peers. To federal prosecutors, he is now defendant number 1 in a 47-count indictment that includes charges of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering, and aggravated elder abuse. Behind the public persona was something else entirely. The investigation began in October 2022. A bank compliance officer at a regional credit union in Mobile, Alabama, flagged an unusual pattern. Pension deposits arriving in the personal checking accounts of nursing home residents were being withdrawn in full within 72 hours of posting. Not toward facility fees. Not toward family. The funds were moving through a series of prepaid debit cards into shell LLCs registered in Delaware and Wyoming. The compliance officer filed a suspicious activity report. It landed on the desk of Special Agent Diana Reyes at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Reyes pulled the threads. What she found was not one fraudulent account. It was 38. All of them belonging to residents at Holloway-operated facilities, all of them showing identical withdrawal patterns, all of them flowing into the same web of shell entities. But Reyes noticed something else, something that did not fit the profile of a standard elder fraud case. Several of the resident accounts were also being used to apply for credit cards, secure short-term lines of credit, and, in 4 documented instances, lease apartments in cities the residents had never visited. Cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, Birmingham, Houston. Why would a fraud ring lease apartments using the identities of nursing home patients? The answer, when it came, would change everything. By March 2023, the investigation had expanded into a multi-agency task force involving the FBI, Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, the ears criminal, Investigation Division, and Homeland Security investigations. A confidential informant inside one of the Holloway facilities, a former licensed practical nurse named Carla Mendez, came forward with allegations that went beyond financial crimes. She described residents being moved between facilities without family notification. She described medical records being altered. She described a separate wing at the Glenview Manor facility, accessible only by keycard, where she had seen unfamiliar individuals coming and going at night. People who did not appear on any staff roster. People who, she said, did not look like nursing home residents. She described, finally, something she had witnessed 2 months before her resignation. A black panel van pulling up to the loading bay at 2 a.m. 2 men carrying a stretcher. A young woman, semi-conscious, being wheeled into the restricted wing. Mendez had not reported it. She had children. She had a mortgage. She had been told, plainly, by her supervisor that the wing was private contract care and that staff who asked questions did not last long at Holloway facilities. When she walked into the Tampa field office on a Thursday afternoon in March, she handed agents a USB drive. On it were photographs she had taken of internal documents over a period of 14 months. What was on that drive shifted the case from financial fraud to something prosecutors would later call one of the most cynical exploitations of vulnerable adults in the modern era. Here is what investigators came to understand. The Holloway operation ran on 3 parallel tracks. The first was conventional Medicare and Medicaid fraud. Inflated billing for services never rendered. Charges for therapy sessions that lasted 4 minutes documented as 40. Pharmaceutical reimbursements for medications that were either never administered or were diverted and resold. Federal investigators would ultimately calculate this fraud at $47.3 million over 6 years. The second track was systematic identity theft. Residents with cognitive decline, particularly those with advanced dementia or no surviving family contacts, had their identities harvested and weaponized. Their social security numbers were used to open credit lines, lease properties, register vehicles, and establish business entities. Because the victims were in many cases physically and mentally incapable of monitoring their credit, the fraud went undetected, in some instances, for years. The total documented identity theft losses would exceed $12 million. The third track was the one that haunted the investigators: the leased apartments, the unmarked vans, the restricted wing at Glenview Manor. Holloway facilities, federal prosecutors would allege, were being used as logistical infrastructure for a human trafficking operation that exploited foreign nationals brought into the United States under fraudulent caregiver visa programs. The pipeline worked like this. Recruiters operating in the Philippines, Nigeria, and Romania identified women in economically desperate circumstances and offered them legitimate-seeming employment as certified nursing assistants at American long-term care facilities. The women paid recruitment fees ranging from $4,000 to $11,000, often financed through predatory loans secured against family property in their home countries. They were issued H-2B and J-1 visas processed through legitimate, though shell, staffing intermediaries. When they arrived in the United States, their passports were confiscated upon intake. They were told the confiscation was a routine immigration compliance procedure. They were housed in apartments leased under the identities of nursing home residents. They were transported to and from work in unmarked vehicles. They were paid a fraction of the wages promised, with the bulk garnished as housing fees, transportation fees, and recruitment debt repayment. They worked 16-hour shifts. They were threatened with deportation if they complained. They were told that local law enforcement was paid to ignore them. Some were told this was true. In at least 2 jurisdictions investigators would later examine, it was. 43 women had been trafficked through the Holloway system at the time of the raids. Investigators believe the actual number, across the full duration of the operation, exceeds 180. The April 4th raids were coordinated across 11 facilities in 4 states. 240 federal agents, 47 local law enforcement officers, 12 federal prosecutors on standby. At Glenview Manor, agents breached the restricted wing at 4:14 a.m. Behind the keycard door, they found 6 women, ages 22 to 34, 3 of them visibly malnourished. None of them spoke English fluently. All of them had their passports stored in a locked cabinet in the facility administrator's office. At the Holloway corporate headquarters in Sarasota, agents executed a search warrant on Dr. Marcus Holloway's private office. They recovered 3 encrypted laptops, a safe containing $340,000 in cash and bearer instruments, ledgers documenting payments to 7 individuals later identified as recruiters in 3 countries, and a single manila folder labeled in handwritten block letters, insurance. Inside the folder were photographs, names, compromising material on 3 state regulators, a county commissioner, a state assemblyman, and a federal immigration officer. The blackmail file would become the basis for a separate federal corruption probe that, as of this reporting, remains ongoing. Holloway was arrested at his residence in Boca Raton at 4:47 a.m. He was wearing pajamas. He asked the arresting agents if he could finish his coffee. He was denied. The aftermath has been measured in numbers, and the numbers do not stop. 47 individuals indicted. 31 already in federal custody. 11 facilities seized under federal asset forfeiture laws. 2,140 residents in those facilities placed under emergency state guardianship while alternative care arrangements were made. 217 confirmed elderly victims of financial exploitation, with restitution claims totaling $59.6 million. 43 confirmed trafficking victims placed in federal protective programs, with T-visa applications processed on emergency timelines. 180 estimated additional trafficking victims whose locations remain unknown, the subject of ongoing international investigation. 3 deaths now under reinvestigation as potential homicides. Residents whose accounts continued to receive deposits and generate fraudulent billing for months after their documented dates of expiration. 3 deaths. That number deserves to be read again. In a press conference held on April 11th at the Department of Justice, United States Attorney Patricia Voss addressed the case directly. The defendants in this matter, she said, did not simply steal money. They identified the most vulnerable members of our society, those who could not advocate for themselves, those whose families had entrusted their final years to a system built on the promise of dignified care, and they used those individuals as instruments, as shields, as cover for crimes against other vulnerable people brought to this country under false pretenses. There is a particular kind of cruelty that requires the systematic dehumanization of 2 separate groups of people simultaneously. That is what we allege occurred here. That is what we will prove in court. FBI Special Agent in charge Robert Kellman spoke after her. The investigation that led to today's indictments would not have been possible without the courage of one bank compliance officer who refused to ignore an unusual pattern, and one nurse who refused to ignore what she had seen. We are asking, today, anyone with information about similar operations at long-term care facilities anywhere in this country to contact the FBI tip line. We have reason to believe that the network we have disrupted is not the only one of its kind. Read that statement again. We have reason to believe that the network we have disrupted is not the only one of its kind. How does an operation of this scale persist undetected for nearly 7 years? The answer is unsettling, and it is structural. The American long-term care industry operates at the intersection of 3 regulatory systems: federal Medicare and Medicaid oversight, state licensing authorities, and county level adult protective services, and falls cleanly into the cracks between all 3. State inspectors check for clinical compliance. Federal auditors check for billing irregularities. Adult Protective Services responds to individual complaints. None of them, by design, look for what the others might miss. Residents with cognitive decline cannot file complaints. Family members, if they exist, often live in distant cities and rely on the facility itself to provide updates on their loved ones. Staff turnover in the industry exceeds 50% annually, ensuring that institutional memory is short and that new employees rarely question established practices. The Holloway operation exploited every one of these vulnerabilities with precision. It is fair to ask, at this point, what you can do. If you have a family member in long-term care, request itemized billing statements directly from Medicare or your insurance provider, not from the facility. Review them. Question charges that do not match the care being provided. Request access to your loved one's financial accounts and monitor them for unusual activity. Establish independent contact with at least one staff member outside of administration. Visit at irregular times. If you work in a long-term care facility and you have seen something that does not seem right, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Reports can be made anonymously. Whistleblower protections exist and have been upheld in federal court repeatedly in cases of this nature. If you have a loved one working as a foreign caregiver in the United States and you have lost contact with them, or if their employment circumstances do not match what they were promised, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-373-7888. Dr. Marcus Holloway is currently being held without bail at the Federal Detention Center in Miami pending trial, scheduled to begin in late 2026. He faces a maximum sentence of life imprisonment if convicted on all counts. His TED Talk has been removed from the platform. His published research is under review for potential retraction. The Florida Healthcare Association has revoked his lifetime membership. Eleanor Whitfield, the 87-year-old retired schoolteacher in room 214 at Glenview Manor, has been transferred to a state-managed facility in Clearwater. Her family was contacted by federal investigators on April 6th. They learned that day that $186,000 had been withdrawn from her late husband's pension account over the previous 4 years. They had not known. They had trusted the system. That trust, prosecutors will argue, was the most valuable asset the defendants ever stole. The investigation continues.